if I could just turn to Gary at Ark & Co, I wonder, what are your thoughts on how clients are currently balancing risk with reward?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, the client basically wants to get where he or she wants to go, where and when. So, if we step back to say, well, the decision to either operate an aircraft, whether it's via charter or whether it's to acquire it or to lease it, or it all comes down to what the client wants to do, and how simply and quickly can they do it. How much of a solution does the aircraft actually provide for them versus, staying at home using commercial transport or what have you. And so from that point of view, I think that overarching principle hasn't changed. What has changed, as you heard from Gary and James, is that some of the inputs into those complexities have moved a little bit. I mean, I guess, from my perspective, the things that I'm seeing is that some clients need a little bit more managing of expectations, particularly in terms of when they're coming in and they either come from they're well known and they're well versed in investing in other asset classes, whether it's a yacht or property or classic cars or what have you. And then when they get to aircraft, they think that they know the answers. And one of the things that happens very quickly is that managing of expectations. It has to be done quite carefully, and it comes down to the trust that an expert partner can provide is basically along the lines of saying, actually, oh wait, what do you mean I can't fly from point A to point B because crew duty limitations? Or what do you mean I have to pay as James was talking about, an upfront charter fee? I just want to fly from point A to B. Or in my case, what do you mean I have to pay such and such in terms of technical inspection fees or legal fees? I just want to get access to the aircraft. And a lot of this is, I think, it comes back to the same thing that we've all been doing in our respective spheres of the aviation industry. It's all about managing those expectations in response to the changing environment that something like COVID-19 has presented.
It is an important element of that management actually advising your clients on the correct expert advice.
Very much so. I mean, I think one of the things that's really sort of key here is that, especially with aviation, it's a complex field. There are multiple facets of it, and I am not a lawyer. I am not an operational expert. What I do is finance, and I think one of the key values here of having a panel such as this is to be able to point people in the direction of the particular piece of expertise that they need at that particular moment, and bring the team together so that the best deal or the best solution for the client comes out. Because as I said, this is all about, from the client's point of view, what's the solution to get from point A to point B when he or she wants to do it, and as quickly and safely and conveniently as possible.
A very experienced pilot once told me that although aviation can be very efficient and very safe and very convenient, if you take your eye off the ball, the rate of wrongness increases exponentially.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
I think we can probably also notice from what you're saying that there is an emerging ownership trend where perhaps people are placing more value on their jets as assets. We've always heard the business aviation industry talk about the jet as a tool for moving people around. And I wonder now if it is becoming an even more valuable tool, and whether you see perhaps the value of jets increasing and perhaps even a preference for new jets over secondhand.
Well, certainly, I think one thing that has stuck since 2008 is that the industry learned a very, very strong lesson back then, because in the run-up to 2008, there were people who looked at business aircraft as appreciating in value fundamentally, and that proved not to be the case. And I think the industry, by and large, has stuck to that axiom of truth, basically. So the way that I put it, aircraft are still fundamentally depreciating assets. There are, within that, there are always going to be micro markets or specific transactions where someone will pay over the market for, because there's a particular need that that particular aircraft and that particular transactions fits. Or there will be certain aircraft at certain times that they become particularly desirable, and so there's a little bit of a market bump at that point in time. But those things are very much exceptions to the rule, and they're almost impossible to predict, because it's all about balance of supply and demand and what happens to be hot in a particular market, particular geography, particular jurisdiction. And generally speaking, aircraft still depreciate in value. Now, what that means is that for somebody looking to acquire or to make use of an aircraft, basically, what's the value to them? And it comes down to the time and efficiency, productivity gains that they get from using it. It also means from financing an aircraft that rather than sticking your cash in a depreciating asset, you can take it and use that liquidity to fund something else that actually does get you a return, whether it's your business or property or some other return generating asset. And generally speaking, what we see is that there is often this management of expectations when people do first come into the industry. One of the things they often say is, "Oh, well, I see an aircraft and I'm getting a really, really good deal." 9 times out of 10, it's not a cracking deal. It's just it's just what the market is. And trying to manage those expectations about what they will be able to sell the aircraft for, exit the aircraft for at the end of the deal. Those types of conversations have to happen fairly quickly in the process to manage people's expectations. And again, it just goes back to my original point about providing people with the necessary expertise in this, around the particular idiosyncrasies of this sector.
James, I wonder, do you have any additional thoughts on aircraft ownership and then the perceived or otherwise value that people are placing on their aircraft?
Yeah, I do. I do, because of what we're seeing with our client base and what I'm being told daily at the moment, but also a very personal view, which is go back a step. This is not a normal recession where it's driven purely by finance. This is a recession which has a very real human element to it, which is you have had to stay in your house for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. I've very deliberately not been counting for my insanity. But you've been locked up, you couldn't travel, and if you are in the market and even thinking about flying privately, you're still wealthy. And if your liquid wealth has gone from 30 million to 20 million or 20 million to 10 million, or perhaps even slightly less, you're still very much not poor. And summer is coming, you've been locked up and you want to go traveling. And if you still have that kind of wealth, you might be less wealthy than you were this time a year ago, but you can still afford to go on holiday if you've got 10 million in the bank. And on a very personal level, we travel as a family. We spend roughly 1 week a month in the Monaco, south of France area, because that's where a lot of our business generates. And we go together, and this year we're just not doing it. Now, and we're not doing it because I just will not expose my family and young child to an airport environment. And the point I'm getting at is, if you've got 10 million in the bank, but last year you had 20, you can still afford to go on holiday and you still want to, but you're not prepared to go through a public airport. So what are you going to do? You're going to go private. And I think there's going to be a surge of people acquiring and financing, hopefully through our friends at Ark & Co, who we trust implicitly. I'll sneak that in there. There's going to be a surge of acquisitions at the lower end of the market, where people come in and the cost of acquiring the asset isn't that huge. Now, it will be interesting to see what happens in 2-3 years' time, when the true cost of operating these assets, not just the purchase price, becomes very apparent, and whether there's a surge of sales at the smaller end of the market in a few years remains to be seen. but those in a rather haphazard fashion are my personal views.
Sure, and it's based on what you're saying there, and in fact on what I'm reading and hearing elsewhere, is that as we look to the future, it seems likely that more companies will be using private aviation for their corporate travel needs, whereas they might well have put executives into business class or first class on commercial airlines. That means a new breed of passenger will be coming along into the private aviation sector. And I just wonder how the business aviation industry will adapt itself to not only attract but retain these customers in the future. And maybe if we can turn to Elite Avia again, what do you think the operational solutions will be for your aircraft owners moving forwards, and perhaps new owners, not only in their own flying, but also in chartering out their assets and making the most perhaps of what could be an unusual opportunity?
Okay, well, obviously we all hope that the industry is going to, well, I hate to use the word boom, but we all hope there's going to be an increase in, new clients, new owners, new charter clients into the market who previously have, for whatever reasons, have not gone into that area. So we hopefully we're going to see an increase in that, which will bring its benefits. The more owners we have, the more aircraft for charter, the more you talked about retaining these people who are going to come into the charter market, for instance. The more offerings you can give these people, the more solutions to their needs, the better. And that's how we're going to keep them, in the industry, how we're going to keep them on our fleets. And you have to operate, all the safety efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. But I think now more than ever, you have to demonstrate, and this is what business aviation can do very easily. You have to demonstrate the benefits of this, you and your family in one aircraft, in a very simple process of getting from your car, which is safe, to your aircraft without going through the main terminal, without waiting 3 hours in a lounge and getting on an aircraft with 200 and something other people sharing the same air circulation system. And I think that is going to sell itself in a way to people who perhaps haven't experienced private travel before, who will do it for the first time, immediately see the benefits. And it's happened throughout the years, with clients who, for whatever reasons have never chartered a jet before, all of a sudden they do, and they think, how did I ever live without this? How did I ever travel EasyJet to my house in Mallorca? Why haven't I been doing this for the last 10 years? And I think the product is there and will sell itself.
Sure. It's an interesting point. It will sell itself. And I was going to go on and ask James what he thought this new customer would require legally, but I'm going to swap that around and say, how do you ensure that these people will get the legal advice that they'll require to fly safely?
I think it is incumbent on the operators and the managers to make sure that the aircraft are flying safely. And I think the regulations and the advice from the different jurisdictions and the health organizations within those jurisdictions is changing. But it will not be an overnight process. And at the moment, everybody is still finding their way. I think from a consumer perspective, and 90% of what we do is advising individual clients rather than operators and managers. There's very little to be done in that scenario for the owners and the charter clients. It is the responsibility of the operator and manager to ensure that they are providing safe environments. And I think legally, it's not so much a case of what do you do in advance, it's a case of operators and managers. Sorry, go back a step. It's not a case of what do operators and managers do in advance in the contract or terms of business or on paper in black and white. It's on a practical, sensible, real world basis. What are we doing to show that we have made all possible efforts to create a safe environment? So I don't think it really is a legal question at the moment. It's not something that you could just say, this is a few extra clauses you put in a contract. It's being able to show that as a business, you're doing everything possible, certainly reasonably possible, to create that environment.
Okay, thank you. I've saved one last, really almost unfeasible question for Gary at Ark & Co, which is not knowing. We know nothing actually about what's going to happen next. Let's assume that these positive thoughts we've all had here today are correct. How do you see this affecting aircraft financing over the next few months?
Well, I suppose it can only, if things continue to develop as in the best case scenario, I'll put it that way. It can only help, the case for aircraft finance. Because again, I suppose if we're looking at this against the backdrop of the reality that over the next few months and certainly over the next couple of years, the general world economy is going to be counting the cost of all the lockdown measures, of all the economic fallout from all of that, and that the business aviation industry is not going to be immune from that, despite hopefully a bump in interest, a spike in utility, at least in the short term. The case for the aircraft still continues to make sense fundamentally. In the sense of saying that against the backdrop of commercial aircraft service retrenching as airlines try to recover, people who are time poor are going to have fewer options to get to where they need to go quickly. I think against the backdrop of remote working and Zoom, there is still very much a place for face-to-face interaction, and people are going. I think one of the things we're seeing now, even on a webinar like this, is that it's still, while it's useful to have a webinar, it's also there's a different sort of level of interaction you would get if we were all sitting around the table discussing this with an audience. And I think that kind of face-to-face need is not going to go away. So if you kind of then work forwards from that and saying that there's always going to be a fundamental need to get people where they need to go, and that if there are options that are available to them to do that safely, flexibly, conveniently, then business aviation really kind of ticks all those boxes. One interesting area that will come up is how the environment side of things happens, and what happens there. That I think is a wild card that we're still going to have to deal with. We're still going to have to innovate in terms of the way we fly, the fuels we use to fly, the technology that's in the aircraft to reduce our environmental footprint. But if we can manage that alongside at the end of the day, the needs and the justifications for business aviation are still there, and they're probably stronger than ever.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. That kind of concludes a very insightful gaze into the future, which let's all hope perhaps at last will mean that business aviation can finally really show what it does. Someone said to me just recently, business aviation doesn't have to excuse itself anymore. All of a sudden, it's really showing what it can do. So again, thank you all very much, gentlemen.